There's a specific moment that repeats itself in your life like a haunting echo, and it happens when you unlock your device expecting something, anything, but you're met with absolute emptiness. You navigate through digital platforms where you witness clusters of individuals appearing euphoric, their faces illuminated by artificial lighting, their bodies pressed together in crowded spaces, creating what society has labeled as meaningful human connection. Yet, as you observe these curated moments of supposed joy, something cold and substantial settles into your ribcage, creating a particular variety of quietness that feels different from ordinary silence. This isn't just being alone. This is a specific psychological state that modern civilization has taught you to interpret as a personal deficiency, a fundamental flaw in your human operating system. The prevailing cultural narrative insists that if you find yourself existing without a surrounding network of relationships, you have somehow malfunctioned, that you represent a deviation from the standard human template, that you have catastrophically failed at the most basic requirement of our species. They attach labels to your condition, calling you socially defective, emotionally unavailable, fundamentally unsuccessful at the game of life itself. But what if everything you've been conditioned to believe about your isolation represents a complete inversion of reality? What if the reason you exist with minimal or zero meaningful connections isn't rooted in your inability to form bonds, but rather emerges from a psychological architecture that actively rejects anything synthetic, performative, or fundamentally dishonest? What if your solitude isn't a symptom of brokenness, but rather a sophisticated defense mechanism protecting something infinitely more valuable than temporary companionship? If you enjoy stories like this, consider subscribing. Most people who watch aren't subscribed yet. There exists a fascinating concept within the field of evolutionary psychology that researchers have termed the apex paradox, and understanding this framework will fundamentally reshape how you interpret your social position. The principle states that as any organism evolves toward increased specialization, enhanced efficiency, and greater capacity for dominance within its ecological niche, its social requirements naturally contract rather than expand. This isn't a flaw in the evolutionary design, but rather a feature that emerges from the mathematics of rarity and specialization. Consider the behavioral patterns across the animal kingdom, where creatures organize themselves according to their position in the hierarchy of capability and threat. Sheep, being prey animals with minimal individual defensive capacity, cluster together in massive herds, because their survival strategy depends entirely on numerical advantage and collective vigilance. Lions, occupying a higher position in the predatory hierarchy, form smaller social units called prides, typically consisting of related females and a small coalition of males, because their enhanced capabilities require fewer numbers for survival and success. But when you examine the truly apex predators, the ones who have evolved to require nothing beyond their own individual capacity, you discover a completely different pattern. The tiger, perhaps the most perfectly designed solitary hunter in terrestrial ecosystems, walks alone through its territory, encountering other tigers only for the brief purpose of reproduction before returning to its natural state of solitude. This isn't loneliness. This is optimal design for a creature that has transcended the need for collective support. If you're currently watching this content, there's a statistical probability, approaching certainty, that you have experienced a persistent sense of disconnection from the dominant social environment throughout your entire developmental history. You have likely expended enormous amounts of psychological energy attempting to compress yourself into social containers that were never designed to accommodate your particular shape. You have experimented with wearing various social masks, adopting different personas, modifying your authentic communication style, all in a desperate attempt to achieve that elusive sense of belonging that everyone else seems to access effortlessly. But regardless of how skillfully you constructed these false identities, they never quite adhered properly to your actual face. The mask perpetually slipped, revealing glimpses of something underneath that made others uncomfortable. You have arrived at this particular video because somewhere in your consciousness exists a growing suspicion that your cognitive architecture processes social reality through fundamentally different mechanisms than the majority of people you encounter. That suspicion represents accurate self-perception rather than paranoid distortion. If this is resonating with something deep in your psychology, hit that like button. It helps this message reach others who are walking the same path. What we're going to examine today goes far beyond surface-level personality preferences or simple introversion versus extroversion models. The first distinctive characteristic found in individuals who navigate existence without extensive social networks is what neuroscience researchers describe as hyperacute pattern recognition. And this cognitive capability functions simultaneously as both an extraordinary gift and a heavy burden that creates profound social isolation. The vast majority of people move through their interpersonal interactions in a state that closely resembles sleepwalking, where they process social exchanges at the most superficial level of analysis. They hear the actual words being spoken, phrases like, "I genuinely care about you," or "I will always support you," or "we share a real friendship," and they accept these verbal declarations at face value because doing so requires minimal cognitive effort and preserves emotional comfort. This represents the path of least resistance in social navigation. But your cognitive system doesn't operate this way, and it never has. You possess an inability, or perhaps more accurately, a constitutional refusal to accept verbal content without simultaneously analyzing the nonverbal communication channels that reveal what's actually being transmitted beneath the surface language. Your neurological wiring compels you to track microscopic facial movements, detect subtle shifts in vocal tonality, measure the precise timing delays between question and response, and construct a comprehensive threat assessment based on data that remains completely invisible to average perceivers. Psychological research has identified this capability under the technical term thin slicing, which refers to the ability to extract accurate patterns and predictions from remarkably narrow windows of behavioral observation. When another person delivers a compliment in your direction, but the muscles surrounding their eyes fail to contract in the specific pattern associated with genuine positive emotion, you don't just notice this discrepancy. You feel it as a threat signal, and you accurately identify the envy or resentment hiding behind their pleasant words. When someone verbally agrees with a position you've stated, but their vocal pitch elevates slightly, or their breathing pattern changes, you don't hear agreement, you hear deception, and you begin wondering what agenda they're actually advancing. You perceive the shadow moving behind the mask, while everyone else only sees the mask itself. For individuals with standard pattern recognition capabilities, a typical social gathering represents an enjoyable exchange of positive energy, an opportunity to experience belonging and collective joy. For you, that identical environment transforms into an overwhelming tsunami of data, a deafening cascade of contradictory signals that your brain must process and categorize in real time. You're not experiencing the party, you're analyzing it. You're watching people engage in elaborate pretense, suppressing their authentic thoughts and feelings and desires to maintain their position within the social hierarchy. And because you can see the performance for what it is, you cannot participate in it without feeling like you're betraying your own consciousness. This recognition ability makes you dangerous to be around, and people sense this danger even if they cannot consciously articulate why your presence creates such profound discomfort in their nervous systems. But there's something even more disturbing about how this pattern recognition shapes your social destiny. The experience of being in group environments while possessing hyperacute pattern recognition creates a particular dynamic that others consistently misinterpret. You often remain silent during social interactions, not because you suffer from shyness or social anxiety in the clinical sense, but because you're engaged in a completely different activity than everyone else present. While they're participating, you're observing. While they're performing, you're collecting data. And the most unsettling aspect of this dynamic is that people can feel your observation even when you're saying absolutely nothing. They sense that you're perceiving something they're trying to hide, that you're seeing through the carefully constructed persona they present to the world, and this creates a threat response in their nervous system. They cannot articulate exactly what makes them uncomfortable about your presence, so they resort to vague labels. They call you judgmental. They describe you as too intense. They say you're hard to read, or that there's something slightly off about you. But what they're actually trying to express is far more specific. What they mean is that you function as a mirror, and when they look at their reflection in that mirror, they dislike what they see. You reveal the gap between who they pretend to be and who they actually are, and most people will sacrifice almost anything to avoid confronting that gap. If you have experienced the loss of friendships or the gradual dissolution of social circles, I want you to engage with a specific reframing exercise that may fundamentally alter how you interpret those experiences. Did you actually lose those people, or did you expose them? Did they depart because you exhibited toxic behavior, or did they flee because you represented the only person in their social environment who refused to purchase the act they were selling? Your current state of solitude may not represent a personal failure, but rather the natural consequence of your clarity of perception. You have developed what might be best described as an allergic reaction to inauthentic behavior and dishonest communication. While other people possess the capacity to swallow the poison of artificial social interaction and continue smiling, your system immediately rejects it like a body rejecting a transplanted organ from an incompatible donor. You're not experiencing loneliness in the traditional sense. You're experiencing the isolation that comes from being unable to accept lies as truth. The reason you cannot maintain friendships that depend on mutual delusion is because your nervous system physically rejects deception, the way your body would reject contaminated food. This isn't a choice you're making. This is an automatic response generated by cognitive architecture that prioritizes accuracy over comfort. If you've ever lost someone because you saw too clearly, share this video. Someone in your past needs to understand what actually happened. The second characteristic that creates profound social isolation operates at an even deeper level than pattern recognition, touching something fundamental about how you experience the activity of social interaction itself. Within the physical sciences exists a law called entropy, which describes the tendency of all systems to move toward disorder, toward randomness, toward a state of maximum chaos. This same principle applies to the majority of human social interaction, where conversations tend naturally toward meaningless noise rather than structured information exchange. Most of what people say to each other consists of entropy in its purest form. They recycle dead information about weather patterns, about sporting events, about their negative feelings toward authority figures at their workplace. It represents the social equivalent of white noise, sound without signal, communication without content. If you currently exist with few or zero meaningful friendships, probability suggests you possess what psychological research has identified as high need for cognition. And this isn't simply about possessing above-average intelligence. This represents a biological drive, a fundamental requirement of your nervous system that operates at the same urgency level as hunger or thirst. Research in personality psychology has demonstrated that individuals with high openness to experience and high intellect don't just prefer deep conversation, they physically suffer when forced to engage in shallow interaction. Your dopamine levels drop, your cortisol spikes, your body enters a stress state. Small talk isn't merely boring for you, it represents something closer to theft, the systematic stealing of your limited time and cognitive resources. Consider Maslow's famous hierarchy of needs, that pyramid structure that psychology students memorize during their education. The vast majority of people operate at the bottom levels of this hierarchy, focusing their mental energy on survival concerns, safety requirements, and the need to belong to a social group. Their conversations naturally reflect this positioning. They discuss other people. They dissect recent events. They process their immediate emotional reactions to their circumstances. You operate at the top of the pyramid, in those regions labeled self-actualization and transcendence. You want to discuss abstract ideas. You want to decode the underlying patterns that shape future possibilities. You want to engage with the fundamental mysteries of consciousness, reality, and human potential. When you attempt to introduce these topics into a standard social environment like a dinner party or casual gathering, the response follows a predictable pattern. Conversation stops. People exchange uncomfortable glances. Someone releases a nervous laugh and deliberately redirects the discussion back to safer territory, back to the comfortable noise that everyone can process without effort. You become categorized as too heavy, too serious, someone who doesn't understand the unspoken rules of polite society. This creates an impossible choice that you've been facing your entire life. And the decision you made reveals everything about your true nature. But there's a third trait that makes you not just misunderstood, but actively threatening to certain personality types. This impossible choice presents itself to you repeatedly throughout your social development, and the option you selected has determined the trajectory of your entire relational existence. You can perform a cognitive lobotomy on yourself, deliberately dumbing down your communication, pretending to invest emotional energy in celebrity gossip, forcing yourself to generate enthusiasm about mundane topics, all to maintain the appearance of normal social functioning and thereby secure the presence of friends. Or you can maintain your authenticity and accept the silence that comes with it. The majority of people, when confronted with this choice, select the lobotomy option. They would rather exist surrounded by fools than stand alone with their own thoughts because the fear of isolation overpowers their commitment to authenticity. You chose differently. You selected the silence. This decision doesn't emerge from arrogance or from a sense of superiority, though people will consistently accuse you of both. This represents energy economics in its most fundamental form. You recognized at some point in your development that you possess a finite amount of mental energy each day, and spending that precious resource on social entropy feels equivalent to setting money on fire while simultaneously forcing yourself to watch it burn. You crave the deep dive conversation, the exploration that extends into the early morning hours about the nature of consciousness, about strategic thinking, about the reality of mortality, and what it means for how we should construct our lives. And because 99% of people feel genuine terror when approaching those depths, 99% of people cannot qualify for friendship with you. You are a deep-sea diver attempting to connect with people who refuse to leave the shallow wading pool, and you need to stop apologizing for your depth. The third distinctive trait found in individuals who walk alone is perhaps the most controversial to acknowledge, but it explains why you experience such consistent resistance from group environments. Researchers studying child development sometimes diagnose this trait as oppositional defiant disorder in young people, but when the same characteristic appears in adults who have learned to channel it constructively, it reveals itself as the trait of the independent genius. This is the constitutional refusal to submit to arbitrary authority, the inability to comply with demands simply because they're being made by someone claiming power over you. Most friendship circles don't operate as democracies despite their superficial appearance. They function as miniature tyrannies, as microcults with unwritten laws that members must follow to maintain their position. We hate this person, therefore you must hate them too. We believe this political position, therefore you must believe it too. We're going out tonight, therefore you must come too. This represents the herd instinct in its purest form, the biological urge to conform to group standards to maintain safety. Subscribe to this channel if you're done pretending. Join the others who chose the real over the comfortable. The famous Asch conformity experiments revealed something terrifying about human nature, and you represent the rare exception to a rule that governs almost everyone else's behavior. The Asch conformity experiments, conducted in the 1950s, demonstrated that 75% of people will agree with an obvious falsehood simply to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with group consensus. When researchers placed individuals in rooms with Confederates who all claimed that a shorter line was actually longer, 3/4 of subjects agreed with this objectively false statement at least once during the trials. The social pressure to conform overpowered their direct perception of reality. You exist in the 25%, the minority that maintains accuracy even when it costs them social acceptance. You are the glitch in the matrix, the error in the program that was supposed to produce uniform compliance. When a social circle demands your agreement on matters you haven't independently verified, when they require you to adopt positions you haven't personally reasoned through, your brain doesn't experience this as a request for cooperation. Your brain experiences it as an attack, triggering a threat response that makes compliance feel literally impossible. You don't feel safe in the herd, you feel suffocated. You possess high need for autonomy, meaning you cannot respect a person merely because they've achieved popularity. You cannot agree with an idea simply because it's currently trending, or because everyone in your social circle has adopted it. You require logical structure. You require evidence. This makes you an absolutely terrible friend to narcissists, and narcissists are far more common than most people realize. Narcissists collect friends the way some people collect accessories, assembling an entourage of people who nod and clap and provide constant validation. You don't nod. You ask questions. You ask why. And the word why represents perhaps the most dangerous sound you can make in the presence of a fragile ego, because it demands justification. It demands that claims be supported. And this requirement threatens the entire house of cards that the narcissist has constructed. Because you cannot be controlled through social pressure, because you refuse to abandon your critical thinking to maintain group harmony, you often get cast out of social circles. Groups will label you as difficult or arrogant or not a team player. They will attempt to exile you, hoping that the psychological pain of loneliness will force you to return with your spirit broken, ready to obey whatever terms they set. But this is where you consistently confuse them, because you don't return. You don't crawl back begging for readmission. Instead, you thrive in the exile. You use the isolation to build something that wouldn't have been possible while you were wasting energy managing their emotional needs and performing for their approval. This trait, this fundamental inability to become a sheep, is precisely why you walk alone. But it's also why you remain free while others remain trapped in webs of social obligation, accumulated debt, and systematic lies. You have traded popularity for sovereignty, and sovereignty may be a lonely kingdom, but it's the only kingdom worth ruling because you actually own it. The fourth characteristic that explains your isolation involves how you relate to time itself and what you consider worthy of your finite attention.